I work for Liquid Telecom. I head up engineering for the group. So today we're going to talk about implications of OTT policy and regulation. This is going to be a panel, and I've got more than 100 years of experience in the ICT industry in this panel. And maybe thousands, because you guys are part of the whole ecosystem. So let me introduce the panelists we have today. The way we're going to run it, we're going to have a presentation that's going to cite a recent study by Commonwealth, by CTO, the Commonwealth Telecommunication Organization. So on my right here, on my immediate right, is Dr. Martin Koyabe. Martin, like me, lives in London but works in Africa. So Martin is the manager and head of technical and support and consultancy. He has about 20 years ICT experience, ICT innovation. He's worked for cybersecurity consultants, helping countries in Africa like Botswana, Uganda, and also has also been involved in strategic planning and innovation and regulation. Please welcome Martin. Of course, we can't talk about OTT and not get Uganda involved, right? We've got the chairman of the ICT Association of Uganda, Albert Mucunguzi. So Albert is the chairman, and he also founded a leading ICT publication magazine called PC Tech Magazine in Uganda. And he also is a technology entrepreneur. Please welcome Albert. And known to you more than to me is Dominic Cull. I think it doesn't need any introduction. Dominic is an ICT law expert. He specializes in electronic communications regulation, and he also founded his own Ellipsis Regulatory Solutions, right? Please welcome Dominic to the panel. Prenesh, sitting at the far end, is the ex-CTO. Prenesh Padayachee is the ex-CTO of Internet Solutions, a company we all know and love and have worked with. Now he's still a director and ex-director at Dimension Data. He's a strategic consultant. Now he's got his own strategic consulting firm, and is involved in strategy in the telecom space. His passion, he tells me, is driving the cost of communication, especially in the developing economies. Okay, please welcome Prenesh. Nice. So the Commonwealth Telecommunication Organization was mandated recently to conduct a study on OTT services in order to understand the market dynamics of traditional business models and also the opportunities for innovation and trying to stimulate economic growth. So Martin is going to present the findings of his study and also spark some debate and also talk about the issues he found worth talking about. I just want to line one thing on the study. I read part of the the study, and what I quite like about it is got 4 stakeholders: the government, regulators, and policymakers on one side. Then number 2, the ISPs, which are the telecom broadcast networks and operators. And number 3, the OTT providers themselves, the vendors and content providers. And number 4, all of us, the consumers. So I don't want to steal the thunder from Martin. You have the stage, Martin.
First of all, thank you very much, the organizers of this particular event. It took me roughly about 22 hours to arrive yesterday, but I'm glad I'm here in one piece. I think Mathew has actually given a very good overview of what I would have said in the first 5 minutes, and thank you for saving my time. So what I just want to do is let's go into the business of what we mean by the study. So first of all, I'll share with you some of the lessons we've learned from the study. That's number one, in terms of the over-the-top services and some things that we've understood them to be, which I'll share with you. And then secondly, I'll do a deep dive into some of the intricate issues that the study found out, and then leave it to the debate. And the floor, I'm sure we've got a lot of experts in this room who can actually debate further what needs to be done. At the end, I will leave you with what I would call the way forward in terms of a consensus. But again, it is debatable. That's why we're in this particular building. So without further ado, let me see what we get here. Initially, when we started the study, we needed to understand, first of all, how do we define OTT? Everybody has a definition for it. And I think many people would agree that it has been referred to as a service over-the-top communication that bypasses traditional network distributions, whether it's the running over or on top of the core of the network, and therefore anything that runs on top but does not necessarily have anything to do with that particular core network, then it has been referred as over-the-top. However, this definition has also found a little bit of some opposition from different quarters. And I think lately, people have said, let's refer to it as an online service provider. So basically, OTT service providers will be referred to as online service providers. But I think that, again, I leave it to the floor. There are a number of definitions that we had to define or to read about, and some of them, I think, was based on the research that we conducted. ITU has a definition, the OECD has a definition, and therefore, the one that was closest to what this study used was the definition by the EU, whereby I think it refers to it as an online service, yeah, that can be regarded potentially substituting the traditional telecommunications and audio services and so forth. So that became almost close to what we thought would be able to define what the OTTs are. But again, they went even further to define and say, look, OTT, when you define them as online services, so you can have either online services or managed services. You and I know that when you manage the services, you manage them all the way up to the access, and thereafter, you might want to leave it to the customers to decide how they manage those particular services. And therefore, online services use partly public service or public internet, which we all know. But the key is what I've underlined. That is what we used for the study as the definition of what we understood the OTT to define. So having put the definition away, let me try and share with you what we found out as some of the key drivers. I think we all agree that some of the key drivers is the use of OTTs today, where it's being used mainly for communication and media. So there are so many, there's a plethora of applications, of actually platforms that are using these particular services, but communications and media. But I'll define some of the types as we go along. I think the application economy drives the use of these particular OTT services. So we have seen the expansion of the app economy, whether it's being used at the application developers level, whether it's being done by the device manufacturers, and we'll talk about device manufacturers. Everybody wants a slice of what is being generated from this. There is also the issue of connectivity. I think we've been talking about infrastructure. I think that is now a very common adjective. It runs on top of the infrastructure. That actually matters. So you have to think about what runs on top of the infrastructure in terms of content. So availability of the high-speed infrastructure, again, is a very key driver. Then we have the issue of the growth of affordable smartphones. The growth of affordable smartphones. What you see there is just a snapshot up to last year of the growth of smartphones, especially in China, because that's where you've got quite a number of very nice innovation coming up, and you've got very many phones that are actually coming up. So you can imagine they had a growth of up to 47% within the country itself. So when you look at the numbers, whether you're comparing Apple or whether you're comparing Samsung, if you look at the margins, you can't actually compare with the consumption rate in the country. And to illustrate what we're talking about, I think it is the issue of the look and feel that is also driving the way we use these applications. I didn't know that even when you scroll up, because nowadays when you scroll up, there's a continuous scroll that you have. There's a science behind that. The reason why your messaging has a red button, there's a science behind it. So the look and feel, the way we have to stick into these particular services is really, really a big business. And when you think about it, so that is a Huawei P20. Does somebody have a Huawei P20 here? You see, Huawei P20, it looks almost similar to an iPhone X, correct? See? Very similar. There you go. That's an iPhone X. A Huawei P20 looks very similar to a Huawei phone. And again, it's an issue of pricing. But when you see the look and feel, it's almost similar. So when you want to go to those debates and bragging rights of who has a more expensive phone, it doesn't matter in this case. But we can still go to that because the pricing differs. So one is roughly about 3 times the other. But the issue is the look and feel. That's where the business is. That's where the push is. So everybody can be able to afford these phones. And because of this, it drives the uptake of the applications that we're calling the OTTs. And we'll come to the reason why this is important. There's also the sense that the provision of cloud is very key, because what cloud does is that it gives us what we call the champagne model. I can have services anywhere, anytime, any place, on any device, at the time that I want. So therefore, it doesn't matter what happens. I think three weeks ago, my laptop crashed, but that wasn't an issue. And I was actually in South Africa, just to be coincidentally, I was actually here. And the point is, you will still go back to the cloud, get your file, and business continues. So therefore, the flexibility that the cloud infrastructure brings, again, it allows the flexibility of using these applications. But that aside, the study also found out that there were 3 types of over-the-top services. And I'll just go very quickly because this is something that we already know. So the first one, I think we all agree, is the voicing and messaging. The voicing and messaging has, in itself, huge numbers behind it. So you can see, this is a snapshot of figures that were taken in the first quarter of this year. That means after December last year. So if you look at the active users, we are really talking of big numbers. And I think now it's really more than 1.5 billion in terms of the number of users for WhatsApp. Facebook has actually gone up more than 1.3 billion. So we're talking of really huge numbers. And there's a very, very good reason why these numbers matter. So again, communications, where you've got voicing and messaging. And we know many of the telcos, and I'm sure most of them are represented here, we have issues because this is where probably our revenues are being sliced off. But it's subject to debate. There's also what we call the, did I go further than that? I need it. I don't know what happened. So this is the application ecosystem, whereby you have an ecosystem of application. They're non-real time, you can save information, you can retrieve information, you are given a bouquet of applications that you can use offline. And that's actually one of those particular services that you have. The other one is the media streaming, which we've seen very commonly, especially for the YouTube and Netflix. And again, this is just what the study found out in terms of the types of services that are there and the types of OTT services that are available. So you can demarcate them into three. But the point is, why is it that we all use these applications today? So let me share with you that. And what we call here in the study is what we call the sticky effect, the reason why we keep using them. So first of all devices are fairly compatible. So we've seen this compatibility. And compatibility is key. So it makes it much more flexible. There is the issue, as I said earlier, of the expansion of the infrastructure. And here we're seeing closely things like, for example, in 2030, where we're going to have 5G. Who knows actually what comes next? But the point is, there is the abundance of bandwidth. And that makes it more attractive for people to build applications that can be able to be useful and be able to serve you and I going forward. There are things like, for example, the application on various platforms. I think we all agree that iPads have become almost like tools for babysitting. Do we agree? If a child cries, iPad, yeah? If a kid brings issues and you can't deal with it, give your daughter or your son a mobile phone. And they play with it. They know how to deal with it. In fact, some of them are techies in the house. They help us to debunk a few issues when we have issues. So therefore, these are not just applications. These are not just platforms. These are things that are actually intricate to our lives. So therefore, the stickiness is unbelievable. A young person today knows exactly what they want. They move very quickly from one stage of a device to the next because they believe they know exactly what they want to use those devices for. There is also the concept that this information or these services are free. But remember, what I've done is to quote the word free, because you and I know very well that these particular freemium services are not actually free per se. So your information is very critical. They will give you a free service for you to give them that particular information that they want, and then they will use that information with a third party to generate capital. Can just somebody tell me in this room, who knows what the customer number for WhatsApp is? Anybody? Customer number? Customer service number? Yeah, nobody knows. It just works. It just works. Nobody has a clue who to call if WhatsApp has an issue. But it just works. That's the key. Convenience. It just works. But the point is that what they actually make out of the information that they get from you is huge. Hence the issue of them leveraging the cost versus you being able to pay for that service before using that particular service. And I'm sure there are people here who will talk about taxation and we'll talk about that and we'll find out what is it that we mean by taxing people to use the services. So the jinx of the issue is to understand a few things. And I think the impact is critical. So let me run very quickly on the impact. And in terms of advantages and disadvantages. And what we found out in this particular study was that, I'm sure this button is moving so quickly that I can't imagine. What we found out is that there are issues to do with the impact. And I think these are things that have been demonstrated before. There are things like benefit to the world. I mean, it benefits from worldwide coverage, impact of the internet. But more broadly, we've talked about broadband connectivity. We've also seen things like, for example, exploiting publicity revenues. And I want to make a point here. In 2016, 2017, Google in itself, in terms of the revenues that it got from online advertisement, was close to $90 billion US. That's what we're talking about. Facebook made roughly closely just above $30 billion US. This is online advertisement. For the first time in 2017, it surpassed advertisement on normal terrestrial networks. So the revenues you get from advertising online are huge. In fact, there is a term that many young people use, and when I say young people, it includes everybody who is young, both in mind. But the point is that there's a term called a YouTuber. Nowadays, you can become a YouTuber. You can become somebody who makes revenues out of YouTube. In fact, I was told to become somebody who makes revenue out of YouTube, think of a hobby. Think of something that you like and tell people about it. In fact, I was reading the other day, this guy just goes eating in any country. And he tells us how good food is, how he enjoys the food, where he goes eating. And when you look at the number of hits in terms of who views, it's in millions. And with time, you grow your empire. And we've seen this from very young people and many, very, very many creative people online using specific products to create a specific outcome of those particular products and being able to generate revenues. So that is a big industry in terms of how much you generate from that. The key point, again, at the last one, I've talked about the high negotiation power towards suppliers. You remember the figures I showed you, the 1.5 billion, the 1.3 billion. Those figures matter. Think about it this way. If you had an innovation in any part of the world today that would do something, you would always see the big players at your doorstep to buy that innovation. And that's what happens. So they'll come and buy it because they have the numbers, they have the resources, and they'll buy it. And we've seen that in terms of either whether they are startups, in terms of AI companies, startups, in terms of any other technology, they'll come and buy it. But that's what happens. There are some issues that we need to look at in disadvantages, but I don't want to dwell into this. Of course, there's the issue of it's difficult to assure end-to-end quality of service. We've seen cases where most of the OTT service providers don't contribute to the USF in terms of the Universal Service Fund of those particular countries where they operate. Those are issues for debate, and we can debate them as time goes by. But more importantly is what operators have actually talked about. Things like losing revenue, things like taxation. And I'm sure somebody from Uganda will talk more on this one. And there are also issues like personal data protection. What do they do with your data? That's something that we need to debate on. And then there are security concerns in terms of how they handle that data and how do you control that particular information. So it's very, very hard to do this. But these are issues that the study was able to dig out going forward. But what I want to share with you is how we went about this before we go into the key issues. But before that, let me share with you something here. I think we've seen cases where as a regulator, it is difficult to be able to actually regulate the destructive ICTs technologies that are happening today. And this is because most of these applications that we've seen have the concept of the shared economy. If you take, for example, Uber, and I'll extrapolate on this a little bit shortly, you would find that it uses both the ICT component, there's a communication component, and so forth. As a regulator, you've got to make sure that you're able to deal with these particular challenges. Same applies to Airbnb and any other. And you'll find that for these particular examples that I've given, they've got one thing in common. They innovate, and they use that innovation to create a service. And unfortunately, that service uses the infrastructure that many of the operators in the room and many of the network owners would actually say they've invested a lot in that service. But that's the basics of it. So let me share with you a quick example, and then we'll learn a few things from there. Yesterday when I arrived at roughly about 3 o'clock. I remember when I talked to the organizers, I said, I'll find my way. I've got an Uber, I'll just get to the airport and I'll get Uber. So my flight arrived at 3 o'clock. At 3:41, I made sure that the Uber driver was aware that I had arrived. And what happened is that at the time when I just decided to take this guy, I decided, let me go out so that I can be able to book this particular Uber and go with it. I was told that, first of all, there are issues I needed to know. One, they don't allow Uber drivers at the airport. That's number one. Number two, there are so many issues about Uber drivers, such that some of them, when they're taken or when you book them, a different person turns up. And in many cases, they do come back to the normal drivers. So of course, this was an issue. Has somebody had this issue at the airport? Cape Town? Uber? Has somebody ever taken Uber from the airport? So how do you get the drivers? How do you get the driver? How does he come and pick you? Sorry? Yeah? So where does he come to the?
Sorry.
To the airport. Where were you picked up from?
At the airport.
At which location?
Parking 2. There's a when you at Cape Town Airport, there's a parking. It says there what parking point to pick up at. They aren't allowed to wait at the airport for some reason, so they have to. They're outside the airport precinct, and when you select, there is a specific point where you select where you're going to stand. It's one of the parking lots, and then they drive in and then fetch you.
Okay, let me share with you something. I think I was naive. I just went out.
It's not that obvious. You have to actually look at you have to look at your app. It's not like hailing them on a street corner.
When I went outside, I'll be honest with you, I think the mistake I did was I told the same taxi guy I'm waiting for an Uber. I think that was a mistake I did. I think that was a mistake I did. I think I regret that. That is the mistake that I did. What they did is they said, look, first of all, they are not allowed here at all. That's the first thing they said. We don't even want to see them here. So I thought, wow, I think I've come into because I didn't want to have a war issue. I knew I had this presentation, it mattered, and I said, let me try and be very peaceful. So then the guy told me that we have a lot of issues with Uber. One, the guy who comes to turn up, or the lady or the person, does not necessarily have the image that appears on the program, or rather on the application. And we went on discussing. So I thought, let me make some peace with this guy to learn something. So we became friends. I told him, Carl, I'm going to use your image. Do you permit me to do that? He said yes. His name is actually Carl. He said Carl. So I told Carl, look, let's make peace, but I want to understand something. Tell me about the issues of Uber in terms of regulation. Let me understand what the challenges are. So while we were going to the hotel, it took us 10 minutes, I think 10, 15 minutes. But this is what we discussed. So number one, he said, look, operating license is an issue. And I agree with him. He said, look, operating license, we are being charged by the regulator, but these other guys are not being charged. So I said, how come? Why not renegotiate with the regulator and say, don't charge us regulating license, because you're not charging the other guys. But again, that was some subject to more conversation, I guess. Then he also said, look, we are locked up. Some of this equipment that we have to pay them back. So I said, look, that's where these guys make money, because they lock you up. It's the same black cab issue. They're locked up, and you have to use those meters. So there's no way out you can actually get. So there's no flexibility. But we went on. There was the customer issues that he brought up. But the last point that caught my eye, or caught my imagination, was how we agreed on the way forward. There has to be a conversation between the parties concerned. And I think that is what epitomizes the study, as Mathew said earlier. So let me just give you what we went through the study very quickly, and then I'll stop there to give other people a chance to talk. So as Mathew said, we had a meeting. There was a meeting that was held in 2016 in London to really look at OTTs, and in fact, to debate the way forward. What was the way forward? The aim of the study was very simple, to make sure that we understand the market dynamics, especially from a policy regulatory point of view, the challenges and opportunities within that. We conducted a number of countries. All the countries that are in the ITU database and our database, we contacted a number of countries. Some of them came back to us, some of them did not. And what we did, we put them in specific sectors. And as Mathew described earlier, we had 4 sectors. So the first sector looked at the governments, ministries, and all the MDAs and agencies in countries. The second sector was owners of fixed or either mobile operators, ISPs. The third was mainly OTT service providers, content providers, and so forth. And the fourth was mainly the users, end users mainly. We had different percentages of responses. These questionnaires were tailored very carefully. We've got the report online, and you can go and view, and we have the questionnaires there for those of you who want to have a look. And we decided to make sure that those questions had been rigorously tested before we send them out. So therefore, we had some test runs with specific user groups before sending them out. The structure of the architectural analysis and stuff like that looked like the following. We had the information. Of course, the contacts came from the ITU database and our database to make sure that we were able to contact everybody. What you're looking there of unsolicited target groups that went into the fourth sector, we just put out a questionnaire and people filled it as they wished because those were end users. For the others, we had to control because we needed to know who was responding back. We had discussions in a number of countries, but more specifically, we went to 3 countries where we had to present the results, the preliminary results of the study. And we got a lot of varied reactions, but overwhelmingly, it was very encouraging depending on what the views were. We were here in Johannesburg, or rather in South Africa, but Johannesburg, and I think some of you who met us there, the images are out now, so you can't deny. But the point is that we were there, and there were a number of issues that came up. The key is that in South Africa, for example, there is the notion that the MDAs, the ministries, departments, and agencies should lead in terms of the debate on OTT. So that was the general consensus. But there was one specific slide that I remember which took us quite a bit. There was a slide where we looked at the reasons why the cookie jar was being fought on, especially on WhatsApp. And this case, I think, is still, I don't know whether it's been resolved. Can somebody explain to us whether it's been resolved? Sorry? Somebody? Can somebody explain to us if this issue has been resolved? The understanding that Cell C was very keen to have over-the-top services, but the big players were not very keen to have that. All right. Doesn't concern many, but that was the case. But the point was that there was an issue whereby small players, of course, would support increasing their footprint in terms of the services that they support, but the bigger players had that particular issue. But again, that was something which was subject to debate. There are also notions, for example, the gambling industry struggles with almost the same problem, where you've got people playing online, but the regulator very busy controlling the physical gambling industry. So that's something that was there. In Kenya, there was a different reaction, in the sense that the country itself has already decided to look at over-the-top services. But it is just an issue of time when that study will be conducted. But already they have other task force looking at similar type of challenges like blockchains and IoTs and so forth. So that's something that they're looking at. But also one reaction that we got in Kenya was we needed to redefine what OTT is all about. There was a case in point, but I think this case has been resolved, whereby how do you treat something like Netflix? Do you treat Netflix as a broadcasting application? Do you treat Netflix as content? And when you look at it from different parts, the person on the left is the person responsible for regulating the broadcasting industry. The person on the right is the one responsible for regulating the communication authority. And therefore, there is that, as I said, a shared economy where one application shares a number of areas, and therefore regulators are required to hold up together. In Nigeria, it was the same. We went there, but the point there was very simple, that the government needs to take control of over-the-top services. And that was a sentiment that were expressed by MTN and very other players that were there. So that's one of the reactions that we got. But let me give you the key lessons that we got from the study. And I'll be done. So the first one was that these are the key issues. One, issues of licensing obligation is important. Two, we need to look at universal service fund. How do these particular players contribute to the universal service fund? Three, there's an issue of taxation, quality of service, and then there's an issue of net neutrality, data protection, and then there was also the interconnection in terms of how do we make sure that we pass these particular interconnection issues across each other. But those are the issues that were there. But let me just give you just a quick glimpse on some of the issues that were raised. In terms of licensing, I think many of the players or many of the countries that we visited or people who responded were saying that it has to be on a level playing field. And how do we do that? So meaning we have to have a regime where people pay specific licenses. And I think this has been expressed even in the example of the Uber driver whom I took yesterday, saying that something has to be done in terms of licensing. There are some cases where there was a notion of no licensing at all, especially when you look at, for example, the UK or Japan, where they don't actually have any licensing. So do we really have to have licenses? I'll leave that to the floor. In net neutrality, I think it was very important, especially in the quality of service. In the quality of service, it's the understanding. The study found out that the understanding of what quality of service is and what quality of experience is, sometimes those two are intermingled. So we need to have a clear understanding of those two. But again, taking it further, there was a recommendation that it is important that the regulation on quality of service for consumers should apply to all players. And again, that is something that was debated in that area. The other part is the taxation. Within taxation, I think it is important that we have to realize that taxation is difficult, especially when you look at cross-border taxation. There are issues to do with some countries impose specific type of taxes, especially when you're buying an electronic equipment and so forth. And then there are other parts where you have to factor the cost of providing these particular services, which is always factored within the taxation. But I'm sure my colleague here from Uganda will share with us some of the sentiments that have been expressed, and I think Zambia has almost followed suit. And of course, the recommendation here is to make sure that you have providers having some regional representation when it comes to taxation. Who do you go to get that particular tax? In terms of data protection, there's no question about it. That was important. We had roughly about 74% of the respondents saying data protection is important. And we've seen this, especially even with cases involving whether it was Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. All these issues have come to the fore. So I think the point about what do we do when it comes to data, how do we actually make sure that the over-the-top service providers who collect data from our users, how do we make sure that we protect that information? What do we do with that information? What do they do with that information? So that's something that we need to look at. And again, with that, there were issues within the issues of, you have to recognize that security traverses beyond borders. There was the issue of internally, many organizations do not cooperate and coordinate, and that also brings a little bit of an issue. Under net neutrality, the key message there was it has to be understood in a better way. And I'll share with you two examples. On one hand, I think we've seen India looking at net neutrality much, much differently. I think they've also gone as far as having a commission to study net neutrality, to understand it so that they can be able to recommend it to players. But we've seen a different case when it comes to the US, where I think repealing net neutrality altogether has been proposed. And again, that is something which is subject to debate, but it's important that that is understood. Interconnection, as I talked about it, is an issue of understanding the service level agreements so that you can be able to understand the service level agreements between whom you're peering with and what the implications of the data that is generated from over-the-top services means for those particular areas. So what was the way forward? In terms of what we believe is that I think it is important to look at the report, but use the report as an information for information purposes so that you can make at least some informed decision. And again, there was the notion of not necessarily impeding the over-the-top services, but instead look at how these services could complement what operators are doing today. I think operators are mainly concentrating on the service provision. But what they should look at is how you actually enhance and add value to your users. And when you look at that, then you find there will be some complementarity with over-the-top service providers in terms of the offering they have. And then, of course, there's the issue of determining specific frameworks that are reasonable. And when you're determining national frameworks, like, for example, if it is in South Africa or any other country that wants to have this debate and to have some OTT framework, which is national, you've got to think about the international implication, because you have to think about the regional and the international implications when you're discussing those national frameworks. And same applies to data protection and privacy. Lastly, let me thank a few people who contributed in this study. Those two people contributed in this study, and I would like to acknowledge their presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think this was quite extensive. Thank you. Right, we want to take the debate further. So I will be inviting you guys to ask questions and to comments to our panel as well. What we want to do now is I just want to go back to one of the points that he made on taxation. The case in point here is what's happening in Uganda. So I'll just invite Albert to just give a few comments on and show us a little bit of what's happening in Uganda with respect to that particular point on taxation.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, everybody. As I've been introduced, my name is Albert Mucunguzi. I'm the chairman of the ICT Association of Uganda. And obviously, we have the freshest experience with regard to OTT and taxation. So I'll just give you a bit of a background. Around March or April this year, the president wrote a letter to the Ministry of Finance saying that they were sleeping, quote unquote, sleeping and not thinking creatively in how they were going to expand the tax base. And he proposed that if taxes were to be introduced on two things, one being mobile money, which if you're from the sub-Saharan Africa is a key facilitator of transactions. And the second he mentioned was social media. And the letter actually said that people who are using social media are mainly just spreading what a local term called lugambo, which means gossip. They're just gossiping on social media instead of doing things which are productive. So he proposed a daily levy on social media and a percentage, 1%. At that time, actually, it was 2% in the original letter on mobile money transactions. So it appeared like it wasn't supposed to be a directive, it was a letter. But because of the political environment, the president actually, his word is law. And when he says something like that, people actually take it very seriously and they go out of their way to make sure it happens. So obviously that was at a key time during the financial year and budgeting planning period. And the responsible committees of parliament then had to go into the process of seeing how this can be actualized. So from the private sector, with the ICT Association and the telecom companies, tried to engage to see what we could do and what the alternatives would be to this kind of tax, because obviously it was going to be very dangerous for the sector. But we lost round one, and eventually the taxes were passed and they came into effect on July the 1st. So it didn't take long really, because if the reason the taxes were being introduced was because people were spreading lugambo or gossip, then the idea was that by making it a little bit more costly to gossip, people would shut up. But the reality is that people who gossip, people who say, who engage in conversations the president doesn't like, will find a way to actually continue saying these conversations, whether through VPNs or through actually paying the tax, which is about $6,000. That's less than $2 per month. It seems a bit low, but there is context. Anyway, let's first look at this graph of what happened before and after the taxes were introduced. This is data from Facebook. I got access to this because of a partner platform that one of the companies I work with has. So on the left is before the taxes were introduced. This is daily active users. And you can see we're averaging somewhere around 850,000 daily active Facebook users. The upper graph is basically combining all platforms that people are connecting to Facebook from. So from July the 1st onwards is what happens after 1% has been introduced, which goes from 850,000 to just over 200,000. So obviously, you can adjust by those who are using VPNs and say that maybe the actual people in Uganda using Facebook after July 1st was somewhere maybe around 400,000. Just goes up a little bit when you adjust for VPNs, but it shows you how severe the impact of this tax was. Now, when the gentleman, my colleague my colleague was presenting about the definitions of OTT, I actually realized that maybe it isn't actually yet as clear as it needs to be, because every time we speak of OTT as the alternative to what would be the traditional way of doing things, you realize that a case in point of mobile money, for example, is non-traditional. If the traditional method of sending money would have been through the bank or through Western Union, mobile money kind of bypasses that, and it creates more convenience and all the things that the research brought up. So the question is mobile money also an OTT service? And back to the case of Uganda, every time the government is thinking about OTT and not happy about social media, for example, or what we would traditionally call OTT, mobile money is bundled therein. And that can be seen in the second graph, where again, 2 years ago in 2016, when we were having the presidential elections, the week of the elections, the president instructed that they shut down, let me call it OTT services. At that point, it was social media and mobile money again. Mobile money because it was seen as the method that the opposition or people he didn't like were using to send money to their campaign agents deep in the villages. And you can see where there's the first arrow that's where the drop was, and the next big drop. So there was growth was being realized until, of course, in July, later that July this year, when we cut down, we introduced the taxes. So, having seen this, the question is, what is government's point of view? What are they thinking? And obviously, the tax to GDP ratio in Uganda has been growing at averagely less than 1 percentage point per year. And in 2017 data shows that it was somewhere around 14.2. And the target was to be able to cross 15% by the end of this financial year. And they thought they said that they wanted to create new revenue sources. And hence, they identified social media as one of the low-hanging fruits because of the estimation they had made, of course, from the 6,000 shillings per month per user. And then the second was mobile money. And jointly, they anticipated about 478 million shillings. I'm not sure what that is in US dollars, but obviously you can Google and check that. So that's one. They wanted to expand the tax base. Number two is the probably misguided view that social media is a luxury and is just facilitating Lugambo. And then the third is the anger from the fact that government can't tax the internet companies, Facebook and Google, and saying they are taking advertising revenue from this market, but they are not paying VAT on this. And those were that is what informed the actions in regard to taxation. Obviously, there are factors that we can discuss for the whole day on what is and what isn't possible in terms of taxation. But the key points to note is that one, the tax on mobile money, the 1% per transaction, immediately led to 71% on the average cost of mobile money. In terms of what would have been the transaction, the cost of using mobile money transactions, it increased by 71% overnight. And 2 weeks later, MTN, who is the biggest player with about 54% market share, they announced that their volume of transactions had fallen by 50%. The figure in shillings was somewhere around 670 billion. That was 50% in terms of volume, the shortfall in just 2 weeks. So this is a direct impact. And when MTN made that announcement, then the president, of course, said that, try not to laugh, that there had been a miscommunication in activating this tax, that it wasn't supposed to be 1%, it was supposed to be 0.5%. So they've now gone back to Parliament to go through the process, the process of kind of changing the law to make it 1%. But as it is, obviously the economy is still bleeding, and most of us have stopped using mobile money, and it's easier to either tell a guy to collect the money or to send it through the bank. You have to keep in mind also that for most of these countries like ours, in sub-Saharan Africa, we rely on these internet companies for infrastructure development, and Google and Facebook have played a key role in bringing down the cost of internet through infrastructure, the cables that they've laid through the Google Project Link, and also Facebook had worked on certain projects to deliver internet to increase the access to broadband in Uganda. So Facebook's argument was that we need you to increase access. We need you to increase your numbers so that we can continue to invest and to facilitate, to continue with the investment that we are making. That if you activate this kind of taxes that are prohibitive, then we won't be able to support you as a country. And these are actual conversations that are still going on. And obviously, I think we can continue with the debate and see where this goes. But roughly, that is what is happening in Uganda. Thank you very much, Mathew.
Thanks a lot, Albert. Carl will join us in a few seconds. Okay, let's we have just realized it's not only just a simple thing that a government does, but it has a lot of impact on even the whole economy and how the whole country functions. So we want to explore a little bit on the issues that Martin earlier pointed out. So I'm going to ask this question. So OTT takes revenue from traditional players. Is that a true assessment? Prenesh, what would you say?
Yeah, that's an interesting question there. So does OTTs take money from traditional players? So in my view, the entire OTT debate has stemmed from regulator or telcos trying to protect voice revenues. That's by and large where I believe this has started, which then moved into media and a whole bunch of other things. So I think, yeah, there is truth in that OTTs are taking revenue from telcos or traditional players. But coupled with that, if the OTTs weren't making any money from what they were doing, so let's take someone that's recording their kid's soccer game and then putting it out onto the internet and not using something like YouTube where you can get advertising revenue, but creating their own page and distributing that video. Would this then really be such a big debate? Because where would you then get the money from? He's sharing content that he's created or she's created and putting it out there for other people to view, and they're quite comfortable with it. And there's so no regulation around it. There's no issue around policy or piracy or confidentiality or anything like that. So if you break this up into, is this about telcos losing money, or is it about how governments get additional taxes in? And I think that's where the real debate of this comes in.
Okay, thank you. Guys, I will invite you as well to ask any questions or make any comments from what Martin has presented and what Albert has presented as well. Any comments at all about the taxation issue in, say, in Uganda?
Hi, Saul from Networks. I don't think the taxation thing is specifically Uganda. I think it's pretty much every country struggling with it. I know there've been talks about it, South Africa as well. We're buying things overseas, we're buying things in different countries that get shipped here, that bypasses that, import duties, and as a result, things that are sourced internationally are able to be purchased and procured a lot cheaper than local supplies. It's a big challenge. What are the alternatives?
Okay, let me try and just share with you what I think we need to do going forward, or one of the ways we can address this. There's no doubt that taxation is complex. I think for people who have done taxation, I'm not a tax expert, but I believe there are good tax experts out there. It is a complex world. Now let's take the over-the-top services. You would register in a jurisdiction that gives you some specific concession on tax. And that one you can do it as any other country or as any other company. And once you do that, then you use the infrastructure that is available to provide your service. So therefore, you're more likely to provide your service, which might be cheaper than the local people that you're competing with, who are actually paying tax in those local jurisdictions where you are. So going forward, I think the issue of taxation, it should be looked into three areas. One, you are looking at a consumer who consumes that particular product. In the case of Uganda, a resident who is a consumer paying tax, which is 200 or whichever value that they're paying into, and the same tax is applied across the board. So you can imagine those who are, living just below the poverty rate or just within the poverty line would have to pay the same tax as any other person who affords it. So when you look at the dividend in terms of the digital dividend, it affects the growth of the digital divide, or rather it actually expands that digital divide. But then when you look at, again, taxation, look at taxation in terms of the middle part. Who is the person either having the medium or the infrastructure to bring that information to the consumer, and also look at the person who is generating that particular information. So I think in the case of Uganda, they've looked only on one side. Let's tax the consumer, but not necessarily concentrating on the people who are actually providing those particular services. And I think that's where probably we need to start. That debate needs to start from how do we collate and have a knowledge of the end-to-end, and how do we tax those? And that one actually requires a global debate, in my opinion.
Chiki had some comments.
Thank you. Michuki Mangi from the community. I just want to respond to Albert's comment whether mobile money is OTT or not. And I think this also goes to the definition of OTTs from the study. I'm slowly getting to sort of a viewpoint that OTT means any internet application that is not owned by a mobile operator. And I would like someone to tell me otherwise.
I don't want to say otherwise, but I think it's not just to mobile operators. I think it's to all operators.
So I think your mic is not quite old.
I just wanted to say that I don't think it's just mobile operators that have this problem. I think it's all telco operators that have exactly the same problem. Because realistically, what applications do telco operators own out there? And everything is an OTT.
Okay. You have some comments?
Yeah, just a minute. Let me respond to Michuki. I think it's a very good issue to bring across. But let me share with you some of the challenges. Vodafone tried the same. They said, let's try and make our own application. British Telecom has tried the same. Let's come up with our own application. The point is this: if you have your own application as a mobile provider, you have to negotiate with the device manufacturers. The guys who actually own the Apples of this world, the guys who own the Androids of this world, you've got to negotiate with those people. There has been a case in the EU where a company was fined for actually non-competitive behavior, a huge fine. The point is, these guys have locked that domain. So an operator today who has an OTT application and wants to devise and want that OTT application to be in every device, you'll have a stumbling block when it comes to those devices that consumers have. That is where the problem is. It has been locked at that point. So operators are trying to innovate, and I'm sure operators in the room will support me. They're trying to innovate, but the problem is, when it reaches at that point, you have a problem. But that said, there is one operator that I want to share, and I've got no qualms about sharing this information because they're trying to actually go beyond the issue of just having the fight between the OTTs and all that. I think Safaricom has shown that you can go beyond that. So they have the mobile money, which is a big market that they have. But now they are moving beyond that to say, how do we work out and just treat digital aspect of things? Let data be the fuel that fuels the innovation for the future. And I think that's how operators should think. But I empathize with operators because here you are paying the taxes locally, but on the other hand, you're told to innovate. But there's some good examples out there. British Telecom is another company that has innovated over the years. They actually own content, or they buy from third parties, they run it on their network, and they offer the quadruplay. So I think operators have an opportunity to innovate in the sense of making sure that they have money and making sure that at least they compete in the world. That's my point.
Thank you, Matthew. So my first comment is on the argument that operators need to compensate for revenue since people are no longer using voice. But I disagree because especially in the case of Uganda, when you look at the transition in terms of user behavior, where people were using, were calling, they now use OTT services, which means they buy more data, and MTN's and Airtel's data revenue has continued to grow year on year, regardless of the different sources. So there's mobile money, which is a key revenue driver right now. There is data, which is a key revenue driver right now. And also keep in mind that people actually still use traditional voice because the device penetration isn't as deep as it would need to be for OTTs to be an actual threat. Now, the 6,000 shillings a month that Uganda is taxing is actually, it represents only stops people from coming on board. And if you're going to have conversations with the different internet companies about taxes and how much do they end up making from your economy if you don't have users online? So they are not making money. If you want them to pay, they will pay a fraction of peanuts, which is peanuts. So I think governments need to treat ICT as an engine for growth rather than an engine for tax revenue. And this is very important.
Okay. Okay, let's move to the next to another point. Data protection. Okay, the OTTs have all my information, all my sensitive information. They know my number, they know my email address, they know all the stuff that I talk about all day. So do we have adequate protection on that? Or should we have protection from what they have or what they can use that information?
So let's look at the way traditional voice used to run and still runs today. So telcos had access to your voice conversations for years in any event, and they were listening to your conversations. So that wasn't an issue then, or realistically, most people didn't know that they were listening to your conversations. Because we live in the sort of online world now, we're concerned about what we do and how we do it and things like that. And I think it comes down to, are the users of the end product educated enough to understand what they're getting into, rather than whether someone is listening to their conversation or storing it, because those conversations were stored for ages. I think the difference here is that we have lots more people online than we had people on old telephone systems previously, but this problem's always been there.
Anyone else with the comments on data protection? Yes, please.
I think in response to that, whenever you sign up to any sort of application, there are pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages, and then some more pages and a few other pages, and then some more pages and a few other pages to go through to sign up for anything. Who actually reads that? Number one, you don't have time to read it, and most people don't understand it. And I say most people, including myself, half of those T's and C's are in legalese. So either you want to use the service and you at their whim and they could sell whatever they want. And there's actually one of the Wi-Fi centers in Manchester actually did this. They said that by using their service, you actually will give your child to them. And they took up one person, and they ended up doing some community service, and it became a publicity stunt. But just to prove that no one actually reads the terms and conditions of what they're signing up for.
Right. So quality of service or quality of experience, as Martin puts across. Legacy providers, if you argue that OTT providers are not subject to quality of service requirements as they are. So what should be done in this case? Should we monitor quality? Should we enforce quality for OTT providers?
I think generally it's very democratic. If your product is good, people use it. If it's not good, they always will move away. I don't believe that we have the capacity to be able to define the quality standards for these services, yet we don't even develop them, and we have absolutely no control of what happens with them. So I think it's about, are the users comfortable with the product or the service? If they are not, they will find its alternative.
There's also an issue of quality experience. Martin, I would really want you to touch on the quality of experience in conjunction with quality of service.
Yeah, let me try and demystify this issue. I think quality of service is important because we need to have a service that is commensurate with what people pay. But what the study found out is that because we are not paying for these particular services, like for example, when you have a Skype call, when the phone goes down or the image is grainy or the pixelation is on the image, we just say, oh, by the way, the Skype call has gone down. Guys, switch off. Let's dial each other again. Then we continue the conversation. Sometimes what Skype does is they would give you something like 3 stars or 4 stars to rate how the call was. We don't even bother. As soon as the call is finished, we are done. Next, we should reschedule another Skype call. So we've got this behavior that says, if we are getting something cheap for free, intuitively, we don't complain. You've seen a case where somebody gives you a lift, the person passes through a supermarket, you are left in the car, but because the person is giving you a lift, you don't complain. You're still taken to your destination. But the point is, if you are paying for that service, if you had something to a contractual agreement within that service, then you have a right for some quality of service. Unfortunately, that right of quality of service comes to the domain of the operators, comes to the domain of the infrastructure owners. And I think what has happened over the years is that OTT service providers have avoided that debate because they know they will have to enter into an agreement with an infrastructure owner to provide that quality of service. So for me, to the audience in the room, is that we need to advocate for quality of service to become an agenda that is out there that people should be able to consider it when services are being rolled out, especially from over-the-top services. So that if they can guarantee us that quality of service, then we use their services. If not, but again, as someone said, it's an open business out there. So the question of quality of service is always the perception and whether we are paying for it. So that's number one. The second part is that the infrastructure owners have a stake because they have to either put more resources in order to guarantee that quality of service, or they have to put something in their systems in order to be able to measure what that quality of service is. The debate that we've had in the previous session has been, should the user have some mechanism to determine the quality of service as before they use that particular service or after they've used that service in order to bring any case against that service provider? I think that could also be another case to debate, but I'll leave it there.
Okay. Sorry, Matt, Martin, I'd just like to ask a question. When you say pay, is the end user paying the OTT provider or is the end user paying the telco?
Was that a question?
Yeah.
The experience here is that there are cases where people pay for the service. I think I've seen Skype having a premium service that people want to use because they know that they'll provide you with some reliable connectivity or reliable calls if you have that. So in some cases, the end user pays for that service. And because the provider of that service has negotiated some path with infrastructure owners, they're able to provide that guarantee. So there is that case where a negotiation is already done and the service that is brought to you, you pay for it so that you get it in a premium way. That's something that is.
Okay.
Just Kyle Spencer, are you referring to the net neutrality violation in the United States known as fast lane paid priority?
In part, actually, that's one of the issues because the net neutrality just brings another conundrum into the play. Let me remind people here. If you look at Portugal, Portugal did the same. What ended up in Portugal? Can somebody remember? All right, nobody remembers. It ended up becoming almost like cable provision. It was so expensive for the citizens of Portugal. So net neutrality will definitely go that direction. That's my opinion.
I was going to touch the point of net neutrality. Okay, you can have it.
Oui, merci. Moi, je suis très... Bon, je vais m'exprimer en français. Hein.
I can see that everything has been in English, but I come from Benin, so I would like to speak in French. I'm very interested in this study, and I would like to see if this report of this study can be sent to us to perhaps add some recommendations from the presentations. I can see that a diagnostic has been made. Indeed, the present situation with respect to the OTTs is very difficult to understand, but I have not seen any debate on regulations, on rules. Everything is based on what we have in our different states. We have no regulations in our state. I would have liked this study to reflect the rules and regulations that exist internationally and that could be applied in our individual states. To end, with respect to the task which we talk about in Uganda, how can we do that? The case that was presented was the case we spoke about the use of Facebook. That is not the only one where there are specific networks that are being used. Why do we only talk about Facebook? Give me a few ideas and keys on why you only use Facebook and if there is anything else.
Okay, what's this for you, Mark? Okay.
Let me say, pardonne-moi, parler petit français. Je suis parler petit français. But let me try to answer you in the way that might be useful. This study has been presented to the 5th Council of African Regulators. It was presented in Lome, Togo, in July. One of the aspects that have come out of this study is that Smart Africa Initiative are keen to make sure that we expand, as you rightly pointed out, the issues that are being faced in specific jurisdictions that this study might not have had some input. And this one primarily applies in cases, for example, of the Francophone Africa and other countries where this study was not necessarily given the input that we wanted. But as I showed you earlier, we contacted all regulators in order for them to provide input. What we've done, and we are trying to do, is to translate the document into French. The document as it is available online, and that link will be given to the organizers so that everybody else can have a chance to debate on it. So that is as far as we are at the moment. So there will be more good news coming probably near where you are, in the sense that we are now talking to the regulators to initiate internally some conversation going forward on over-the-top services, because this is no longer a national issue. It is a global issue, as you can imagine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
There was a comment for me, I think, about the case in Uganda and why we're using Facebook. That's because the simple reason is that because it's the only data we can access right now, or at least so easily, but also because it is the biggest social media platform. Before the taxes were activated, we had about 2.9 million users, and it is head and shoulders above all the others. And so it's a representative platform that we can use to see what the impact is, but also the data is easier to access than most others.
Okay. Thank you all for the questions. Just to close up, I just want to maybe, Prenesh, you can give us your overall view of what you think the future of the regulatory regime will be like on OTT.
Can I go?
Okay, I just had a question for Albert. So I'm Kevin Chege from Internet Society. So I wanted to ask, so your graph was very interesting. I'd like to know what has been the impact of the use of VPNs on the ISP networks, because when you switch on a VPN on your mobile phone, it means your traffic goes outside Uganda, then comes back. So if I'm in Uganda and I'm running a VPN on my phone, it means if I am browsing something on a neighboring ISP, it's gone to Europe or US and then come back. So what has been the impact?
Unfortunately, I don't have statistical data on this. So I think any comment I make at this point might be speculative, but Kyle might have something to say.
I mean, I've seen some traffic statistics from large transit providers in Uganda that show that there was a significant uptick in traffic to hosting providers like SoftLayer and others that commonly host VPN platforms and such. So it's hard to quantify because of the nature of VPNs, but we see indications that there was a very large jump.
Okay. When you see the timekeeper standing up, I wouldn't think he's asking a question. I think he's saying everyone should leave the stage. Okay, so to close up, Prenesh, you were telling us what you think of the future of OTT regime.
Yeah, so I think this is going to be a complex area for a long time to come. And I think if we break it down into the various areas, if you look at sort of Martin's presentation and break that down into the various areas between quality of service, taxation and those types of things. I think the most difficult one would be the taxation regime rather than anything else in that, because you're looking through so many jurisdictions, and the reality of the internet, there is no boundaries to the internet. So what would you have as the sort of overall framework for regulation and tax across many jurisdictions that operators work in? But with that said, I think there may be a room for major OTT players to comply with some sort of regulation in each of the countries that they operate in. But we need to be careful about that, because by and large, I think the effect of all of that is going to be that the end user is the one that suffers through all of this, rather than any of the telcos or OTTs or anything like that, because the end user will end up paying for these services that we're trying to regulate.
And in one sentence, Albert, what would you want to see in Uganda?
Well, the case of Uganda is very fluid. So maybe what I would like to not see anywhere else is for everybody to avoid making the mistake that Uganda has made. And meanwhile, if we have influence, let's try and speak to Uganda from to make sure that we correct the wrong that we've done. I just looked at a quick graph. The social media tax from different cities is somewhere between 2.4% to 22.6% as a percentage of individual income. That's how significant it is. So let's try and not make the same mistake. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your story. And Martin, any closing remarks and what the future studies you'll be sharing with us?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this particular occasion. But let me just make sure that we understand each other here. As a group, which is technically savvy, there are some things that need to be done, not even yesterday, but very urgently. So first of all, the issue of OTT has to be dealt with in a conversational manner, but more importantly, as a block. You cannot act on an OTT issue at a national level. It has to be debated as a block. That's number one. Numbers matter. You remember the slide about numbers? Numbers matter. In Africa alone, we are 950 million people. That is the number you need to negotiate with Facebook. You cannot negotiate with Facebook with 40 million, 30 million. That story will not be understood. So you really need to go with a big number. Smart Africa Initiative is trying to drive this particular agenda, and will come out with a prescription soon of how this can be driven. So that's that aside. The second thing is we need to make sure that we practice what we preach. If we talk about data protection for our citizens, let's build the infrastructure in country to support the operators, the service providers to be able to keep that data in country. So data protection, privacy is important, but regional regulations is also possible. We've seen the GDPR and how effective that has been. So that is impossible. The third prescription is that let us not block over-the-top services in whichever shape or form. OTTs are here to stay. The key is to innovate. And I want to underline that word very carefully. Please, let us innovate. Let us not look at OTT as a stumbling block, but let's look at it as a complementary to what we already have. Thank you very much.
I will continue to use the OTT services as they prescribed. And I think that, as you say, is innovation. I truly believe that we all should contribute and innovate. They've been a very wonderful audience, and I would really want to thank our panel for the wonderful debate. Is that a question or thank you?
Hi, yes, Diarmuid O'Brien from Uganda. Just one of the things that was mentioned there was the GDPR, and I'd like to hear the panel's opinion on this hypothesis of mine. one of the beauties of the GDPR is the extremely penal penalties that are there. And the penalties are for corporations, so 4% of annual turnover or 20 million euros, which are fairly serious penalties. Recently, I have been looking at the different drafts of the data protection bill that has been put before the Ugandan Parliament, and I know that the ICTAU recently, I think was it you to talk to them, but one of the things that reading it is the penalties are harmless. Like, so you basically have penalties for individuals of 8 million shillings, which is, you know, sort of 2,000 euro. So the penalties are quite small, and there's no real penalties for corporations. But the real, you know, from my, the real big, let's say, criminals and all this are corporations who are loose with people's data and loose with, you know, laptops getting stolen that are not encrypted and people's data getting out there. So I'd love to hear the panel's opinion as to how Africa should go. Should it follow the GDPR and have extremely stiff penalties, or should it do the kind of Ugandan thing and little small penalties?
I think you just touched the raw now. This is something that I'm so passionate about, but we can talk after this over coffee. Just for the sake of time, I think it has reached a point whereby we have to think as a block. GDPR is effective because Europe can negotiate as a block. Therefore, any organization that wants to participate in business with Europe, you've got to follow the GDPR. That's number one. Number two, the law works. If they fine a multinational company billions of dollars or billions of pounds or billions of euros, that is the way it is. So therefore, if we want to go forward, or if this community wants to push this agenda forward, we have to make sure that we preach what we say. Let the law work. Let us go as a block. That is the way to negotiate. You cannot go as a country to say that you're protecting your own border and expect the multinational to follow your restriction. They will negotiate with the neighbor. And therefore, you are neutralized. The only way to go, think about it this way. If we said no data from any African country will be shared outside the continent, think how the impact will be. So that's for the floor. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. We have a few thank yous we want to do to our presenters. Okay, we have some presenters and panelists that have come in, and we just want to say a few thank you to them. Angasie, I know he's not there. I'll take this one for him. Mike Needham, is he around? And Graham Beneke. No, even if his friend can come on his behalf, it's fine. Prenesh. Albert. Martin. Okay, thank you. You've been a very wonderful audience, and to our panelists, another round of applause. I think we'll break for tea now. We'll be back in the next 20 minutes for the lightning speeches. Thank you.